What happens when someone becomes convinced they are always the victim? What unfolds within a person who, unable to face their own shadows, decides that all evil comes from the outside world? At first glance, the victim may appear to be the most harmless figure in any story, the one who suffers, who had no choice, who was hurt without reason. But under certain conditions, that figure can transform into something darker, more dangerous, and more destructive than we imagine. We live in a time where sensitivity to the pain of others has become a moral virtue, and rightfully so. We've learned to listen, to avoid judging too quickly, to offer safe spaces for those who have been hurt. But amid this openness, a distortion has also emerged, the worship of the wound. Not its healing, but its perpetuation. Not the growth that comes from pain, but the identity built from it. The result is a troubling phenomenon. People who don't want to leave the place of suffering, because from there they gain power, attention, emotional impunity, and a perfect excuse to never change. Carl Jung didn't live in the digital age or in a culture of public grievance, but his understanding of the human psyche was so profound that his ideas seem tailor-made for today's world. He didn't use the term victim mentality, but he precisely described the psychological structure of those who refuse to face their own darkness and project onto others everything they can't bear to see in themselves. According to Jung, this repression and projection are the roots of true human danger. Not conscious evil, but the evil done by those who believe themselves to be entirely good. Does it seem exaggerated to say that the one who suffers the most might also cause the most harm? It's not, if we understand what Jung called the shadow, that corner of the soul where all the desires, rage, envy, impulses to control, and thirst for power that the ego doesn't want to accept are hidden. When someone refuses to look at their shadow, the shadow doesn't disappear. It hides, accumulates, and eventually explodes, almost always projected onto others. And so, the victim-minded person doesn't recognize their own darkness, but sees it everywhere. In others, in society, in every glance that doesn't smile at them, in every opinion that doesn't validate them. And because they feel perpetually wounded, they also feel entitled to defend themselves, sometimes cruelly, manipulatively, or even vindicatively, without ever feeling remorse. There is something chilling about this pattern, because a person who hates and knows they hate can still be aware of their malice. But a person who hates while believing they love, who attacks while believing they're defending themselves, who excludes while believing they're seeking justice, can do far greater harm. Jung understood this clearly. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And thus, under the mask of the eternal victim, a silent will to power may be hiding, a rage never acknowledged, a total incapacity for true love. Because love, for Jung, requires admitting that we too have flaws, that we too can be wrong, and that we too must change. This kind of victimism has nothing to do with legitimate suffering, nor with the search for comfort or justice. We are all hurt at some point in life. We all need support sometimes. But the real danger begins when pain becomes identity, when the wound turns into a flag, when the narrative of "I was hurt" completely replaces the possibility of looking inward and asking, "What can I do with this now?" Instead of evolving, the victim-minded person stays anchored in the past, demanding that the world change for them, while they remain exactly the same. This dynamic not only destroys the individual, but poisons their relationships. Because the person who always presents themselves as a victim gradually begins to instill guilt in others. And that guilt becomes a form of power. Power to control, to condition affection, to manipulate decisions, to silence criticism. It's emotional power disguised as weakness. The victim doesn't need to scream. All they have to do is say they were hurt, and everyone around them starts walking on eggshells. And when that becomes a habit, human connection breaks down. There is no longer dialogue, no shared responsibility, no mutual growth. There's only an unbalanced scale where one always suffers and the other always repairs. But the most disturbing part of all is that victimism, like any unconscious pattern, is contagious. Jung called it a psychic infection. When a narrative is repeated over and over, it's always someone else's fault. I don't need to change. My pain justifies any reaction. It becomes normalized. It settles into the collective unconscious. And so, little by little, entire communities begin to see themselves as victims, projecting their resentment onto imagined enemies. History is full of such examples. Peoples who, feeling humiliated or marginalized, ended up justifying atrocities. not out of conscious malice, but out of a collective blindness born from unprocessed pain. Jung understood that when a person refuses to look at their shadow, the soul becomes sick. And if that person has influence over others, they can infect an entire environment. Victimism is dangerous not because feeling pain is bad, but because turning that pain into identity, and that identity into a weapon, slowly corrupts our capacity to love, to understand, to build. The most tragic part is that the victimist often doesn't know what they're doing. They truly believe they are a good person. They truly believe they're just defending themselves. But in their blindness, they don't realize that they are no longer seeking to heal, they are seeking to dominate. In the end, what Jung teaches us is that suffering alone does not make you right. That authentic compassion is only possible when one also takes responsibility. That healing begins when we stop blaming everything external and start looking at the chaos we carry within. And that, paradoxically, only when we stop acting like victims can we transform pain into strength, the wound into wisdom, and resentment into real compassion. So the question remains open and increasingly urgent. How many people who claim to be victims are, without knowing it, feeding their shadow and harming those around them? And what can each of us do to avoid falling into that trap? Because the line between legitimate pain and destructive victimism is not always clear. And crossing it doesn't just affect the one who does, it can drag many others into the dark. Perhaps the greatest danger of victimhood doesn't lie in what it appears to be, but in what it hides. A person who constantly presents themselves as a victim rarely accepts that they, too, can be unjust, cruel, or even selfish. But the human soul is complex. We are all capable of both the worst and the best. Carl Jung understood this very well, which is why he insisted so strongly on the need to confront our shadow. The shadow is not, as many think, a collection of bad traits. It is everything we don't want to see in ourselves, and so we bury it in the unconscious. But burying it doesn't erase it. It turns it into an invisible power that acts from the shadows. And when that shadow disguises itself as victimhood, it becomes almost impossible to detect. Because no one wants to accuse someone who's suffering. No one wants to point a finger at someone who claims to have been hurt. The natural compassion we feel for human pain becomes the perfect shield behind which destructive behaviors can hide. The victim-minded person escapes all self-criticism. And worse, they develop a kind of radar for detecting others' flaws with ruthless precision. Everything others do is examined under a microscope, but everything they do is automatically justified by their pain. It's as if carrying a wound exempts them from all responsibility. Jungian psychology makes it clear. Those who lock themselves into the role of the perpetual victim not only stall their own personal growth, but also block the growth of others. How can you build an honest, equal relationship with someone who always feels wounded? How can you grow alongside someone who can never receive criticism without turning it into an attack? Little by little, these relationships become cages. One person becomes the caretaker, the emotional mediator, responsible for every word said or unsaid, while the other stays perched on a pedestal of suffering. But there's something even deeper and sadder about this dynamic. Victimhood also imprisons the one who clings to it. It traps them in an emotional jail where everything is experienced from a place of fragility. The person starts to fear confrontation, difficult truths, and the changes that require courage. Their world becomes small, predictable, full of justifications. They can't look inward because they're afraid of what they might find. They can't look forward because they're clinging to the past. And so, without realizing it, they gradually give up their power to change. Jung spoke of individuation as the most important process in human life, that inner journey in which we slowly integrate all of our parts, the good, the bad, the beautiful, and the dark, to become a whole being. But the person who sees themselves only as a victim can't start that journey because they refuse to see their part in the drama. Their story is always external. They did this to me, they failed me, they betrayed me. There's no room for the most powerful question of all. What is it in me that also plays a role in this conflict? The person who never asks that question does not transform. They repeat. They repeat pain, patterns, excuses. And worse, they pass that repetition on to those around them. In families, victimhood is inherited. In couples, it's contagious. In communities, it becomes ideology. When enough people believe their pain absolves them of everything, The result is a culture where no one wants to take responsibility for themselves. Everyone feels offended, everyone demands, everyone accuses, but few look in the mirror. It's a culture where suffering doesn't evoke compassion, but competition. Who suffered more? Who has more right to speak, to judge, to take up space? Jung would have called this an inflated ego disguised as humility. Because yes, paradoxically, victimhood is also a form of pride. A hidden pride, masked as wounded humility, that says, look at me, I'm the one who's been hurt the most. I'm the one who most deserves to be heard. And as that identity of suffering is built, the real self, the one that can change, grow, make mistakes, and learn, gets buried under layers of unmovable stories. But the shadow doesn't disappear. It only waits. And at some point, it shows up. Sometimes it erupts in a burst of unjustified rage. Other times, in a betrayal no one saw coming. Sometimes it's a cruel word, a subtle manipulation, a lie disguised as truth. And when that happens, the victim-minded person doesn't feel guilt. They feel justified. Because in their internal world, every act is reparation. Even if it hurts. Even if it destroys. What's most painful is that often, the victim isn't pretending. Their pain is real. Their feeling of being wounded is real too. This isn't about invalidating suffering, but about understanding what we do with it. Because there's a vast difference between feeling pain and using that pain as an excuse to avoid all responsibility. The first humanizes us. The second turns us into prisoners of our own story. And perhaps the most heartbreaking truth of all, a true victim doesn't need to convince anyone they are one. Someone who has truly suffered, who has walked through hell, usually speaks with humility, aware of how fragile everything is. There's no pride in their story. There's wisdom. There's compassion. Sometimes there's even silence. Because when you've met your shadow, you no longer need so much noise. So what now? What do we do when we realize we've fallen into the role of the victim? How do we get out? Jung didn't offer easy answers, but he did point to a clear direction. Look within. Accept that you are not just what happened to you, but also what you do with it. Acknowledge that within you there is also anger, envy, a desire to control. And that integrating these parts doesn't make you a bad person, it makes you a more complete one. Healing doesn't mean forgetting what was done to us. It means no longer letting it control everything we do. Healing is choosing to stop repeating the same painful story so we can write a new one. It's stopping the demand for the world to give us something back, and instead starting to give ourselves what we were once denied. It's about reclaiming power, not power over others, but power over ourselves. Because the greatest act of freedom is to stop blaming. And the greatest act of self-love is to accept that we, too, have a shadow. That we, too, have been unfair. That we, too, have hurt others, even without meaning to. And that if we truly want to change the world around us, we must first look at the chaos within. Carl Jung didn't speak from a place of judgment, but from compassion. A firm, brave compassion that doesn't feed self-deception. He invited us to grow, not to justify ourselves. To face what hurts, yes, but also to use that pain as a bridge toward a greater truth. Because only those who embrace their shadow can live in the light without fear. And it is exactly at that moment, when we stop being victims of the past and become authors of the present, that true awakening begins. Not a gentle one, not a comfortable one, but one that truly transforms. It's curious how the human soul, so eager for liberation, sometimes locks itself inside its own emotional cell. A cell built with bricks of pain, yet reinforced with the mortar of pride. How many times, in our attempt to protect ourselves, do we end up condemning ourselves to repeat the wound? There are those who live with a broken heart and yet display it like a trophy, not to inspire compassion, but to demand emotional submission. They hide behind that pain to avoid changing, to avoid giving in, to avoid opening the door to forgiveness or self-criticism. And in doing so, they turn what could have been the beginning of their freedom into the perpetual cause of their inner slavery. There's no greater tragedy than that, turning suffering into identity. Because pain, when faced with courage, can become a seed of transformation. But when it's idolized, when it's placed on the altar of "I am this way because of what they did to me," it becomes a chain we drag through life. A chain that not only restricts our own movement but also strikes those who walk near us. Victimhood is not only destructive for the one who embraces it, it's a slow poison that contaminates relationships, conversations, decisions. Distrust settles in as a permanent guest. Oversensitivity colors everything. And suddenly, we no longer speak from truth, but from the fear of being misunderstood. We stop being authentic and turn into emotional diplomats in front of someone who, hidden behind the mask of the victim, has stopped listening. Victimhood demands a high price: emotional honesty. Someone who feels like a victim of everything cannot allow themselves to hear what they don't want to hear. Every criticism becomes an attack. Every suggestion, a betrayal. Every disagreement, violence. As a result, relationships lose depth because there's no room for confrontation without rupture. You can't grow with someone who has built a temple around their wound and demands unconditional worship. You can't have a true dialogue with someone who refuses to acknowledge that they also cause harm. What should be a bridge, the recognition of pain, becomes a wall. And what should be a path toward understanding turns into a dead end where only old narratives are repeated. Carl Jung, with his penetrating gaze into the psyche, understood that no real evolution is possible without confronting who we truly are. Not who we believe we are. Not who we wish we were. But that inner creature, complex, sometimes petty, sometimes radiant, that acts even when we think we're in control. Jung didn't want us to be ashamed of our shadow, he wanted us to recognize it. Because only from that place, that brutal but liberating acceptance, can true change begin. But victimhood is precisely the denial of that confrontation. It's a pact with ourselves to never look at what might hurt more than any external injustice. Our own responsibilities, our own decisions, our complicit silences, our renunciations disguised as sacrifice. The world is full of difficult stories. People who have been betrayed, abandoned, abused, ignored. Pain exists and it is valid. But what defines our life is not so much what happens to us, but what we do with it. Some become wise after suffering. Others become bitter. Some use their wound as a compass. Others turn it into a weapon. And that choice is no small thing. It's a choice we make, often unconsciously, every time we decide how to speak, how to respond, how to remember. Living as a victim is comfortable, on the surface. It gives us a clear narrative, excuses us from many efforts. But living as a victim is also a slow death. Because it robs us of the ability to act from freedom. It turns us into secondary characters in our own story. It makes us depend on others' compassion to justify our existence. And that dependency is the cruelest of all. Because if others don't validate us, we fall apart. If they don't recognize us as wounded, we feel invisible. But that's not living. That's barely surviving, anchored to a version of ourselves that, over time, becomes a caricature. Perhaps the bravest thing we can do is look at ourselves with brutal honesty and say, yes, I've suffered, but I've also caused pain. I've felt fear, but I've also been unfair. I've been hurt, but I've also hurt others. And in that double awareness, not a pure victim, nor a complete perpetrator, true freedom begins. Because someone who accepts their shadow doesn't need to hide. And someone who doesn't hide can build real connections. They can speak without fear, love without manipulation, ask without demanding, and receive without guilt. Life isn't fair. It never has been. But that doesn't mean we have to become prisoners of resentment. Resentment, like victimhood, is a way to protect ourselves from pain, but also to avoid change. It tells us we're right, but it doesn't let us move forward. It gives us comfort but takes away our power. And personal power, the kind Jung valued so deeply, is not built on excuses. It's built on responsibility. On the ability to say, this hurts, but it doesn't define me. This left a mark, but it doesn't limit me. This happened, but I choose what I do with it. This isn't about minimizing pain. It's about not turning it into an absolute. About not letting it become our only story. About not making suffering an identity that traps us. Because anything that becomes an identity turns rigid. And whatever is rigid, breaks. The soul needs flexibility, movement, openness. And that's only possible when we stop repeating the old story and dare to write a new one. Maybe the greatest act of rebellion in a world that rewards complaint and glorifies the wound is to own our shadow and walk with it. Not as a burden, but as part of the luggage that helps us see the world more clearly.